Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stage 501. Tonight, I'm your host and MC, Ray M. We have a great guest today, Anthony Avice Du Buisson, and I think we should just move forward with the introductions. And I guess, we can actually start with myself first. As you know, I approach politics from the perspective of the socialist third worldism tendency, and I'm an advocate of post-colonial feminism. But, enough about me. You all already know me fine already. We should just go on to the second card and have Anthony introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I'm a South African-born, Australian-based freelance writer. I write on the Middle East and North African region, especially on minority rights, such as the Kurds. I have a website called philosophyismagic.com, and I've also written for a number of online syndications such as Aria Magazine, Jerusalem Post, and The Region. I am currently studying a Bachelor of Arts with a major in Politics and International Relations and a Bachelor of Laws. Thanks for having me, Ray.
No, it's absolutely no problem at all. I think you're an absolutely fantastic guest, and I was really excited when you said that you wanted to come on. So, we had some conversations about the things we were going to talk about beforehand, and they're listed in the description of this video as well. So I think we have, quite a bit on our table to get through this evening, because the introduction in the section at the bottom of the description says that we're going to be talking about liberal internationalism, humanitarian intervention, minority rights, ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, particularly Syria and Iraq, the present situation in Korea, Iran and the JCPOA, and the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, where would you like to start on this? Can you explain for the audience, how you came to be a believer in liberal internationalism and humanitarian intervention? Because, these are things which have been, have come under a lot of scrutiny and have been, a little bit contentious recently, over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. So, give us a little bit of a viewpoint on where you approach these things from.
Most certainly. Again, thank you for having me. I approach these things after a long course of reading and experiencing a number of things in my life regarding just events to do with humanitarianism. Now, there's a quote that I take after, and it comes from Elie Wiesel, the famous Holocaust survivor and writer. And he has a sort of a quote that really sums up my philosophy in regards to human rights and humanitarianism in general. It comes from his Nobel Prize speech that he gave in regards to his reward for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. It goes, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere when human lives are in danger, when human dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must at that moment become the center of the universe. That quote highlights my philosophy in regards to humanitarianism. Now, I believe that essentially since from a young age, since I was about 16, I started to read National Geographic magazine. One of the magazines that I read was a 1992 issue on the Kurds. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Kurds are one of the largest ethnic groups without a state in the Middle East. And I read about their persecution under the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. This is a magazine from 1992 that you would find usually at any barber's place. And I read this and sort of had an impact on me because it gave me an idea that there were people, for example, who were being persecuted by tyrants. Now, this was just the start because it gave me a sort of a way into another writer called Chris Hitchens, whose readings I have been influenced quite greatly by. People like Chris Hitchens and Elie Wiesel present authors that themselves, due to their experience in journalism and their experience in the world, had perceptions of humanitarianism and the need for intervention against tyrants that I would be influenced by. For example, Elie Wiesel, that speech that I gave you right there, he's a sort of a survivor of the Holocaust, and since he experienced the Holocaust, he wanted to make sure that that never happened again. That's one of the reasons why, for example, the United Nations and other multilateral organizations dedicated to preserving human rights and stability and peace in the world as best they can were created, was to stop the tragedies of the Second World War in regards to genocide. Now, of course, that notion has not been adhered to strongly nowadays. However, the sentiment of taking the side of the victim and aiding them in their struggle, and the sentiment of speaking for those who are voiceless, in other words, is something that I feel quite passionate about, and hence is why the reason why I started actually writing on the Middle East, specifically in regards to things like the Syrian conflict and minority rights in regards to the Kurds, as I mentioned. And that's sort of like where I started from. So that's where my philosophy shares its inception, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the full global perspective, would you say that the reason that you focus on minority rights is because of the fact that you can't have a balanced and just world if some people are being oppressed by others? And this carries over into, obviously, the ability of human beings to engage in productive activities and so on and so forth. That a lot of time and effort is used up in people having to resist systemic forms of oppression that they shouldn't be under in the first place. And that if these were relieved, people would have so much more productivity, so much more space for self-realization, and so on and so forth. So you say these are the motivating factors behind the why of minority rights?
That would be just the gist of it, because as I believe that and what we've seen is that states that are more economically prosperous have some form of judicial system that is robust, has some form of institutionalism that protects civil rights and minority rights. Those are the states that you'll find the most prosperity in, as opposed to states that are tyrannical and who have themselves some form of authoritarianism and mostly to regards to totalitarianism. You'll find a lot of the disregard for human rights. Now, across in the 90s, for example, you had sort of UN Secretary General like Kofi Annan, who said that when it comes to human rights trump sovereignty, because the biggest excuse by a lot of tyrants at that time was that, okay, you can't violate into our sovereignty. However, when human rights are concerned and when it comes to the rule of law and achieving justice, I guess, for victims, the whole notion of sovereignty, in my view, becomes mute. And that it's sort of like it's a moral imperative for states to intervene at that moment, or at least as best they can, to try get rid of as much of the violation of those individuals' rights and to try restore or try to make a sort of a liberal state. That's why, for example, I am a liberal internationalist.
Would you agree with the statement if someone said to you that your view of sovereignty is rooted in popular sovereignty as derived from the works of, like, say, Giuseppe Mazzini and people like this from around that time period, as opposed to the kind of very strange thing that you see perhaps among some progressives even right now, where people are defining sovereignty as being the sovereignty of whoever the ruling class in any given country is. So, for example, let's say you have country X and they're brutalizing their own people, and their defense against, or their rhetorical defense against your desire to intervene is something like, this is the sovereignty of this particular country, and so therefore the rulers have a right to treat their people in this way. Your response would be that that's not actually how sovereignty works. Sovereignty actually comes from below, from the people who are the members of that nation, and that they should be able to actually have sovereignty apart from what the rulers would like to do to them in terms of whatever abusiveness they may be engaged in. Is it basically not that you want to negate sovereignty completely, but rather that your view of sovereignty is from bottom up and not from top down?
That is exactly it. Because since I am a liberal internationalist, I believe in liberal institutions. I believe that fundamentally sovereignty derives from the people.
Yes, well said.
And the people who elect officials. Now, may I just say that when people will often retort, they'll say, oh, well, this dictator X got 99% of the population's vote. In those in those places where you have a lack of opposition, because fundamental to democracy is the allowance of opposition, allowing for dissenting opinions, the allowance for essentially some form of rigorous legislation whereby you have the protection, as I said before, civil rights, minority rights, which includes, of course, the ability to freely assemble and freely organize in whatever political shape or form, as long as, I guess, it's not seditious. Those are what I mean. And so fundamentally, I believe that's where sovereignty comes from. It comes from the people. So when these tyrants, for example, who say, no, 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 no. And what I mean by tyrant, may I just say, are those, for example, who are dictatorial in manner. They are the ones who consolidate power for themselves, have a ruling elite around them. So people like Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad or whatever you want to call these individuals, whatever name they go by, in whatever epoch they may exist, they will always claim that, no, this is Syrian state sovereignty. We have sovereignty to do what we want. We are just fighting terrorists, or we are just eliminating these individuals. However, often at times, those states will deny their own people's rights in terms of the freedom to dissent and the freedom to protest and what have you. So in those moments, I believe that that's they use the rhetoric of defending state sovereignty, or they have state sovereignty to defend themselves. I said that that's incorrect because they are using a sort of bastardization of the term, and that is not really sovereignty. It's more a bastardization of it.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I've heard someone put it to me quite interestingly before, where they were having this conversation. It was, someone from the country that was concerned was having a conversation with perhaps someone who was trying to mandate, what their view of sovereignty was. And the person who was being talked to shot back with, because they were actually from the country that was being discussed. The country being discussed in this case was Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the person fired back in response and basically said, well, your view of, and by your, I mean the person who was having that conversation, he accused that person of basically regarding sovereignty as being a divine right of kings, where just because the person is the ruler of that country does not mean that they have sovereignty to commit war crimes. Right?
There's another aspect to this, and I just want to interject a bit. There's another aspect to this, that there's an aspect of international law as well. Ever since World War II, we have a lot of states at the moment, whether they be democratic or autocratic, who are signatories and who have ratified certain international treaties.
Yes, that's exactly where I was going to go. Yeah. You've foreseen where I was going to go with that. Yes, not only that, they have also signed up to treaties that oblige them to follow certain procedures, to follow certain rules, and to respect human rights.
Yes, because fundamentally these institutions and these international documents are here to protect the rule of law, you could say, justice, as well as human rights at the end of the day. Now, a lot of people like to say, oh, no, it's all about power at the end of the day. I'm sure there is about power. Yes, I'll give them that. However, we have institutions, liberal institutions specifically, which maintain some form of protection of rights for the citizen, and especially in Western states, allow for some form of democratic process. Now, I want to see that expand globally. And you could say, I guess, I'm a bit zealous in this regard because I am, I guess, a liberal internationalist. I want to see this expand globally. Why? Because those are the best systems whereby there's the most prosperity and the most individual rights as attained. Because you have a lot of people that immigrate from these autocracies, essentially, and they immigrate to the West for a better life. And by the way, when I mean the West, I'm mostly meaning developed states, or states by which there's some form of institutional justice, some form of, I guess, affordance for the ability to gain resources, or to ability to gain capital and what have you. Yeah, that's what I mean.
No, so obviously I agree with you completely on that. I mean, you've answered that question in such a comprehensive way that my follow-up question no longer makes sense because you've already said it. So the next thing I'll pivot to then is what I have here as question 3. So I have here as question 3, the rise of Salafi jihadism with ISIS posed a significant security threat to states across the globe. With the war against the terror group largely over, what remain the challenges for the world in regards to the group and others like it? Because, I mean, and the reason I ask this question is because, ISIS, ISIL, depending on which abbreviation you want to use, this was a manifestation that seemed to occur outside of what we ordinarily regard as the Westphalian system, because of the fact that this thing was a non-state that aspired to essentially obliterate all other states which it came in contact with, even though it wasn't really a state structure as we fully understand it. Like, how do you get to grips with that? What are the challenges that remain? And just because they no longer literally have control over territory, does it mean that their ideology has gone away? And what should we do in order to counter the threat which they are still posing to us?
Now, the Islamic State was defeated. I guess you could say its proto-state that it declared in 2014 was defeated in 2019 and 2017 with regards to Iraq and Syria, respectively. One being by the Syrian Democratic Forces, along with the US-backed coalition, and the other one with the Iraqi security forces, along with Hashd al-Shaabi and the US coalition. Now, the defeat of the ISIS proto-state, a lot of people have thought that, okay, this is the end of ISIS. However, they've underestimated the ideology that comes with ISIS. There still remains the problem with over thousands of detainees, including over 60,000 ISIS female volunteers, mostly women and children, who have brought children and who believe in the ideology of the Islamic State that exists in places like Al-Hol camp and other such areas. These people still pose a big threat. There's also the threat of ISIS sleeper cells. Now, a lot with the Salafist jihadist groups, the West has refused to repatriate a lot of these individuals, which has caused the problem of trying to maintain the security of these individuals from potentially running off and becoming a future national security threat. Now, the Syrian Democratic Forces, who have at least 400 soldiers guarding Al-Hol camp, of a population of about over 60,000, may I just say, they are poorly manned. They have a lack of resources. They are dealing with the existential crisis of Turkey in the northeast, which we can touch on a bit later. And then we have the system, that we have to acknowledge the wider conflict that is going on in Syria at the moment, as well as the flawed Syrian judicial system, which cannot deliver a form of appropriate justice towards the trialing of these victims. That's what there's Syria. In Iraq, we, of course, have the flawed state itself, which is dealing with an internal fight still with ISIS sleeper cells, as well as this wider Iranian versus United States geopolitical conflict that is going on at the moment in that area, which you can also touch upon later. So there's a lot of basically non-state actors who are lacking in funds, and you have larger state actors who are inherently flawed. With these circumstances, we have to also acknowledge the fact that there's a potential for a resurgence in the group's ability to pose a threat to the world.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Syria, I mean, you had said to me previously that you had contacts on the ground in Syria because you had actually gone to visit the Kurdish people during the time in which this conflict was occurring. So, like, can you tell me a little bit about your experiences there? What exactly happened? What did you see?
Well, I visited Iraqi Kurdistan, or southern Kurdistan, as it's known by the local Kurds, or Bashuri Kurdistan in Sorani. I visited my local journalist friends. I went around the region, went to places like Halabja, Duhok, Erbil, Rwandas, and I not only paid my respects, I guess, to the Halabja monument there, which, may I just say, in 1988, part of the Al-Anfal campaign, Saddam Hussein launched a lot of chemical weapons against the Kurds, killing thousands of individuals, women and children included. And there's now a monument there in Halabja that I went to visit. You can actually see the wreckage of planes and tanks as well. I went to Duhok as well to pay my respects to the Yazidi homeland in Lalesh, which is near Duhok. So actually in the Duhok province, near Duhok city, I should say. And it's just about an hour drive away. I paid my respects over there. And I also went to Erbil, met with my journalist friends, talked about different matters. And the thing about it is that the US coalition uses the north of Iraq, I would just say southern Kurdistan for this. I've just got to make it more clearer for listeners in the future to understand what I'm talking about. The US-led coalition, backed by Combined Joint Task Forces Operation Inherent Resolve, operates in the area near Erbil. They have the military bases over there as well, and they conduct not only reconnaissance missions but also special operations in neighboring Syria and Rojava. And we can speak about that later as well. But at the end of the day, I actually went to a lot of touristy areas, as well as just did a lot of other activities I can't really mention over here with my journalist friends. But it was a brilliant experience. It was good to catch up with my local Kurdish friends there. And I greatly appreciated the experience because it gave me an understanding of the situation on the ground over there, as well as the humanitarian cost of leaving our local indigenous partner forces to fight against a threat not only of a state actor but a non-state actor as well, with regards to Daesh in Turkey.
It's been absolutely terribly difficult for them as far as I understand it. And, even in the midst of all of those difficulties, they continued to supply the United States with vital intelligence, some of which actually led to the strike that finally occurred against the leader of ISIL himself.
That is correct.
Yeah. And so what did you think, or at least how did they feel? Or did you get an impression of how, in your impression, in your viewpoint, like from your standpoint, I mean, how did it feel for the Kurdish people at the time when Donald Trump began to progressively sell them out to Turkey? I mean, I hate to put it in such an incendiary way, but I mean, that's objectively what it is that he's doing, isn't it?
Well, for the Kurds, who were the first ones actually to help the US coalition when it came to toppling Saddam Hussein, the Kurds overwhelmingly helped the United States in fighting against Saddam Hussein back in the Iraq War, and they're glad that the Saddam Hussein is now gone. However, they were also the ones who pointed out the crouching threat of IRGC, or Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, backed by the Ayatollah regime, activity in the wake of the post-Saddam Iraq, which caused a lot of insurgencies and a lot of post-war instability. Since then, the Kurds have been very wary of the United States because they thought that the United States would back them, for example, in their 2017 referendum. However, the United States backing this one Iraq policy that is maintained since the inception of the modern state of Iraq after Saddam Hussein's fall. They did not back the independence movement, and in fact they allowed the Hashd al-Shaabi, along with the Iraqi security forces, to seize the disputed territory in Kirkuk. This angered a lot of Kurds in the region. Now, with the invasion of the northeast by Turkey and Donald Trump's withdrawal of forces from Tal Rafat and other areas such as Ras Alan, there has been a concern for the Kurds that they don't know whether or not to trust the United States, even though overwhelmingly the Kurdish administration, especially the Kurdish Democratic Party, which currently heads the presidential office of the KRG, which is the autonomous region under Iraq's constitution, as they consider themselves autonomous regardless of the rest of the Iraqi state, they still have positive sentiments towards the United States. I mean, they're still working with the United States and Germany against ISIS, basically. Yes, it's still against them, but you can see there's the sentiment now of what to do, because they don't want to. They hate the Iranians, basically. They hate not the Iranians, I should say. They hate the Ayatollah regime. They hate the Saddam. Yeah. They hate the government in Baghdad, because they view the government at Baghdad as wanting to destroy their autonomy, essentially, which they kind of have a right. They kind of are right, because the Ayatollah regime don't want the autonomous project in the north to exist anymore. And they, of course, hate the Erdogan regime in Turkey as well. And that's pretty much the gist of it. That's their fears.
Okay, so how do you see the difference between the way that the Kurdish people understand the political situation in Iraq versus how it is in Syria? Because you often see online, particularly on social media, where people essentially just mix up Syrian Kurds and Iraqi Kurds as though they have the exact same interests, the exact same trajectory that they view themselves as being on, and so on and so forth. So, like, if you could just explain for the audience, like, what a fundamental difference is between the way in which the movement toward independence is playing out in Iraq versus the way that it plays out in Syria.
Now, people need to actually realize that the Kurds aren't a homogenous group. They have different ideological aspirations. The most notably, they have the Kurdish nationalist aspiration for statehood. They believe that their state is being occupied by four nations: Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, and they believe that they should have a piece of homeland for themselves, or at least some form of autonomy. This differs to the more Apuichi ideology, which is based off of Abdullah Öcalan, who was the head of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, who had a more, you could say, extremist ideology, where he promoted Marxist-Leninism in the form of like this kind of quasi-Kurdish nationalism right up until from 1978 all the way till 2000, until he changed it to this quasi-social libertarian-esque democratic confederalism, which is more of a decentralized ideology. But to cut a long story short, the Kurds of the Rojava, or the self-administration of northeast Syria, which is the de facto government in the northeast of Syria, or known as AANES, this government operates under the ideology of democratic confederalism, which is a kind of a opponent really to nationalist ideology. And the Apuchia ideology is kind of an opponent to Kurdish nationalist ideology in some respects, historically speaking. But there are a lot of Kurds with various different views within the northeast. So you have majority of them being Kurdish nationalists. However, you have also that significant proportion of them being, of course, technically what we could call social libertarians or democratic confederalists. So that's just an example of the variant different ideologies. So how they perceive the Americans in the northeast is quite positive. As comparison, I guess, than to previously, they still have this positive attitude that the United States are the only ones that can actually deliver them a solution when it comes to the political crisis of Syria. For example, a lot of the times there's a saying that goes around that if you want a quick solution, go to the Russians. If you want a long-term solution, go to the Americans. And this has been kind of the attitude of a lot of the Syrian Kurdish leaders that head the AANES. I just want to also say that a lot of the time people like to say, oh, the Kurdish fighters in the area. It's not just Kurdish fighters. There's Syriac, there's Yazidis, there's Arabs, because
Indeed,
the Syrian the Syrian Democratic Forces is a multi-ethnic coalition of different militias operating, all with the common thought of fighting against the Islamic State, as well as building this project of multi-ethnic plurality in the northeast. And at the moment, that's still being built. But I do definitely see a sort of the sentiment that a lot of Kurds are angry at the United States for leaving them and their people, and they're very worried that Turkey will come and invade the rest of their lands. But they don't want the Russians, they don't want the Assad back in, they don't want the IRGC coming in. They hate those forces. They would rather have the Americans, despite whatever the Americans have done, as well as the coalition, over, of course, those what they consider those tyrannical entities from encroaching on them and
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, I don't know if they're looking toward the election that's coming up in November. Like, do they see Joseph Biden's presidency as offering them a better opportunity for accomplishing their goals than the one they presently have with Donald J. Trump?
Well, there's a worry, actually. There's two thoughts. Despite what Trump has done, a lot of people view his stance, at least the kids I've spoken to, against Iran as good. Although arguably some of them don't understand the complexities of his views regarding fighting against the Iranian regime. However, people still remember Biden as the one who was the sort of the signer of the JCPOA and the empowerer of you could say, the Assad regime and the IRGC. So people on that end don't like Biden either, but they would rather take, for example, Biden, who may be semi you could say competent, over Trump, which they view as sort of the selfish, egotistical individual. So a lot of them are actually supporting Biden. Like a lot of people,
like it's easier to predict what Biden might do because of the fact that he is consistent and at least semi-competent. At least I said semi-competent. Whereas with Trump, it's kind of like a random thing because he'll just do whatever the last person who spoke to him told him was a good idea. Is that basically the impression they've got?
That's what the pressure they have got, because there's this perception that the Obama administration essentially left Syria to the dogs, you could say, of the Russians and the IRGC. I think it's much more complicated, of course, but it depends on if you want to go into that or not. But I'll let you continue in your question.
No, I mean, that was basically my next question. So yes, what was their perception of Barack Obama and the way that he left Syria in the first place? We want the full picture here, because obviously you've been told a lot of things. So I have no problem with you essentially expanding on what we're saying, because obviously I'm not going to say that you're not allowed to say what they thought about Obama. Definitely, please tell me.
Well, when it comes to the Obama administration, they were worrying that the Obama administration, through the JCPOA and its false rhetoric on the red line when it comes to Assad's use of chemical weapons, they thought that the JCPOA empowered the IRGC in places such as Iraq and Syria, as well as Lebanon, because it provided an avenue of income for that income to be used to fund these more clandestine activities. And they viewed the Obama administration's reluctance to get rid of Assad, because people like to point towards Operation Timber Sycamore and say, oh, look, the Obama administration wanted to do regime change in Syria. But they failed to understand the nuances of that operation, which was, by the way, just to give people a little sort of brief summary, Operation Timber Sycamore was a CIA operation which helped vetted opposition of the Assad regime, notably Free Syrian Army units, fight against the Assad regime. The purpose of that operation was not to allow for regime change, but instead to force the Assad regime into political settlement as accordance to the UN Geneva process.
Yes, so what does that mean? The way that I understood it as well.
Yeah, in other words, what does that mean? That means using the opposition to pressure Assad into coming to the negotiating table, thereby allowing for political settlement over Syria. That's the only reason Operation Timber Sycamore was created, and it was done so with the help of the Jordanian intelligence as well as the Turkish intelligence. However, it took a life of its own through the subsequent years when the opposition became to fragment, and there was more influx of jihadist elements, which I guess we can touch upon a little bit later. But there was influx of jihadist elements into the opposition, which caused a bit of infighting as well as disorganization. This is why, for example, the United States started to fund more funds into the Pentagon-led arms program to the Syrian Democratic Forces when it comes to the fight against ISIS. And they eventually got rid of Timber Sycamore in about 2017 under the Trump administration. Yes.
That's a very comprehensive and, of course, frankly, correct explanation of what happened there. So, I mean, my follow-up behind all of that is, I mean, do they have a vision now as to how they're going to get out of the fix that they're in if it should emerge that Donald J. Trump gets elected a second time? What do you think their strategy will be at that time?
Now, currently at the moment, the AANES, which is, as I mentioned before, the self-administration of North and East Syria, which is the de facto government in the northeast, which has its own capital in Isa in the northeast, just across the Euphrates River Valley. They're trying at the moment to get a political settlement with the Assad regime, because they want to at least get their own autonomy and their own rights, because that's what they're after at the end of the day. They want minority rights, they want to be able to have control over their own areas, and they want to have some form of democracy. They're almost like the same as the mainstream opposition. However, with the Kurds, I should say not the Kurds, but with the AANES, they're trying to negotiate with fundamentally a fanatical regime, because this fanatical regime has denied them repeatedly the most basic of concessions. I remember back in 2015, where Russia opened up a PYD, you could say, office. By the way, the PYD is the Democratic Union Party. It's one of the largest parties, a part of the Movement for Democratic Society, or TEVDEM, in the coalition. Basically, it's one of the biggest parties leading the AANES. Now, this party, when it opened up its office in Moscow, it had a Moscow delegation actually go on its behalf to try and negotiate with the Assad regime to change the name of the Syrian Arab Republic to Syrian Democratic Republic, to try and make it more multi-ethnic and more inclusive. The Assad regime blatantly refused that, because, again, they refused this whole notion of this, what they call a separatist project, and this whole notion of multi-ethnic identity within their own country, because they want to still maintain this Ba'athist pan-Arab ideology within the state. So what the Kurds are hoping for, at least, or the AANES is hoping for, is some form of political settlement. They're already trying to go for peace negotiations with other opposing Kurdish parties, and they're already trying to get the United States to back them a bit more politically speaking, although, as you can imagine, it's a bit now precarious in their situation. So that's what they're trying to do in the wake of this really precarious situation that they're in.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That does make a lot of sense. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll move you away from that question now onto the next one, because I don't want to focus on one question for too long, given that we're trying to keep this within 90 minutes, and I know what will happen if I essentially follow that path down to every single logical conclusion and every single thing that I could possibly ask you on that. It's going to result in us being here for longer than I anticipated. So I'm gonna be responsible and move to the next question now. So.
Okay, sure.
The next question I had for you is, the last generation of survivors of the Holocaust and World War II are passing away. With the rise of right-wing nationalist groups in Europe and America that reassert anti-Semitic viewpoints and anti-Semitic sentiments, how do you deal with the issues posed by these groups and the underlying ideology associated with them?
I think fundamentally, a lot of these groups are reactionary in their nature. They've reacted to what they perceive as an influx, for example, of refugees to the EU, coming from, of course, the Syrian conflict dimension, which is to say, basically, the Syrian conflict theater, I should say. A lot of these groups are also reacting to the way that they perceive their governments going, and the lack of recognition for, I guess, their own rights within the country, being influxed more by this whole notion of Muslims crossing into their states and trying to take their kind of identity away from them and their own form of, like, whether it be in Britain or in Hungary and what say you, basically. And when we come to places like Poland, when you have this kind of this almost the shift leftward, where you have this this dimension of, you get the whole cliche political correctness going on, which has been, of course, bastardized by the alt-right to mean something more, you could say, sort of like not mean something that it should mean, I should say. When you have this dimension, along with just the existential issues of the humanitarian crisis, such as in 2014, and you have these liberal institutions which have for a long time, and I will admit this, have kind of reinforced this notion of superficiality when it comes to things like human rights, because you have contradictory actions when it comes to just their lack of resolve for certain humanitarian issues in the world, or their policy of not actually intervening in every single case, or trying to contain things like North Korea and elsewhere. Just to cut a long story short, I understand where they are coming from, the sentiment that they have. However, I also believe that in order to address it, we'll have to address some of those little things that they'll have, that they see in the media, and what they see as being a problem. This being, of course, to try acknowledge that, okay, there's this issue when it comes to identity, and it comes to acknowledging all forms of different ethnic groups and different minorities, and empowering those minorities, while at the expense of denigrating, you could say, what is perceived as the white majority, quote unquote, whatever that may mean. This kind of perception needs to change. And I think that the only way it's going to change is really from a multi-pronged approach, by attacking, I guess, focusing on education, focusing on helping to empower certain disenfranchised groups. And I'm not saying every single group, because we know that there's fanaticals around there. We know that there's neo-Nazis. We know that there's Holocaust deniers. We know that there's a whole stew of these people who will believe the most conspiratorial BS, basically, about the world. They'll believe it wholeheartedly, that they'll form their whole principles and ideology on that. We need to try address also things such as media presentation, and the fact that, honestly, our media has focused more towards entertainment, more towards what's quick selling. And this can, of course, give an atmosphere of to try get clicks, they try focus on the small little activities that are creating the sort of the loudest noise, as opposed to what's happening in the sort of the general focus of something. So my solution, I guess, to this, and it's not going to be easy, of course, and it's obviously not going to be anyway straightforward, but from a policy standpoint, I think trying to educate people, trying to introduce, I guess, more forms of acknowledgement, I guess, constitutionally as well as legally, for not only the minority rights, but also for, I guess, the majority as well. If you're going to play that whole identity shtick, if you want to call it, have some form of provision of rights acknowledged for, at least from the surface of it. And of course, then we have to address larger national security issues towards, by the way, when I mention national security, I'm talking about national security of the United States as well as other global states who are interested in, of course, because I don't know why I have to clarify this, as if I'm speaking about some boogeyman entity, but unfortunately I have to clarify it for the idiots in the room.
Someone in the chat was asking that question, actually. In live chat, someone was asking, whose national security are you referring to?
Yeah.
But of course, it means the countries that are being discussed. Yeah,
of course. So anyway, and just to cut a long story short, to finish what I was saying before I allow you to ask me the next question or to follow up on that, is that I believe that we'll have to address the ideology of these kind of groups, especially the white nationalist ideology. We have to try and understand it in terms of its ideological component, because I think a lot of the times when we're talking about counterterrorism or even security matters, we kind of have this kind of very sterilized view of the world, which doesn't acknowledge more ideological claims, doesn't acknowledge more the, so you could say we'll call it, I guess, Platonic realm, where it's just that realm that's not necessarily based in reality, but more of a perception of an idealized reality that people are trying to strive towards, which can sometimes be immaterial of the reality.
Yeah. When you and I were talking a few days ago, I called it the domain of the ritual, which is where, in order to assert a particular identity and to understand their place in the world, there are political dissidents and extremists and so on who have to act out this series of rituals in order to give themselves a sense of belonging amongst the community, which is not physically grounded in a particular flesh and blood community. It becomes something where it's entirely about ideas, and the ideas do in fact need to be addressed.
That's correct. Yes. And do you have so I would assume that you have a follow-up or going on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my follow-up is that so from what you're saying here, you're saying that basically engaging in arguments with people who are in the white nationalist sphere and so on, and presenting to them the things which they may have done wrong and the things which they don't understand may in fact be useful in the grand course of debate, because of the fact that other people are observing these debates as they're taking place, and there are so many people who are basically inside of the ideological realm mostly, rather than interacting with material interests on the ground. There are so many people in the ideological realm that having those debates can actually have an impact. That's what you're basically saying. And I mean, a lot of people don't agree with you on that, but I mean, I would say that it's an interesting argument you're presenting there.
Well, the thing is, I actually guess I would clarify, because I maybe not wording it correctly, but I would say that in terms of trying to understand the nature of the beast, it would help for us to actually trying to listen to some of these groups. However, in terms of solutions, so I would say education from, if they can be educated, because as I said before, I view these people like I view ISIS fighters as well. Like, you'll get some who can, I guess, be shown the error of their ways, but you'll get a vast majority that will be fanatical. And the only way to really to sort of address that fanaticism is to not only understand the nature of the ideology, but gain intelligence against it, so you can work in terms of security measures against it. And a lot of the time, especially
to prevent recruitment as well. I know I'm cutting you off a little bit there, but yes, prevent recruitment. Because if you understand the driving things that bring people into that kind of position, then you can essentially work to alleviate those concerns before people actually make that drastic step of moving toward an extremist ideology.
Yeah, because the thing about it is that we can't pretend as if we live in a lovey-dovey world where we just say, okay, if we introduce them to the power of love, we will automatically change their way. I mean, I understand the reality of the matter. I mean, sometimes you just need to understand their ideology, cut them off from the rest of the society, and contain them. And then, if you have to be, if they get any more extremist, basically, and they want to sort of launch security threats, you, I guess, eliminate them. I know that's a bit like, that will be a bit more controversial and like that, but it's true. If they get to a position in which they endanger society, basically, and they are actually committing acts of basically terror like that for the good of the people and good of the, I guess, not only national security, but good of people's rights as well, you have to isolate them and contain them. And if they can't be contained and they aren't able to change, then you have to, of course, eliminate them, put it that way.
Yeah, and by eliminate, you mean in this case, of course, to send them to jail, as it were, to remove them from the ability, take from them the ability to actually inflict harm on others. I mean, as is the case with all extremist groups that try to operate inside of people's communities.
Now, I do want to say that I don't know, maybe you'll have a question on this later, but there's a couple things I want to address in the chat when it comes to, like, what's the problem with having a white majority state, basically.
Okay.
Is that,
there are some people in the chat who are asking whether there'll be questions at the end.
So should I just leave it? Should I just leave until like the end then? I'll keep letting you go.
I mean, you could do, or you can actually address these as soon as we come back from break. It's up to you as to where you want to put them, because I mean, you are the guest, so we can actually insert them in between.
I would like to sort of like make it like where I can actually address each question at the end.
Yes, because
on the show. So
they're there in the chat right now, so people when they're playing it back would see them anyway. Yeah. So yes, if you want to address it now, that's fine. We're actually at the 45-minute mark, so I mean, we could go to break and then come back and have you immediately address it, or you could address it before. It's up to you where we place the break.
I think let's take a break, because I do want to get to the other question that you have, and then like the end basically answer a bunch of questions.
At the end you want to answer them. Okay,
is that
that's
possible?
Absolutely fine. Yes, absolutely fine with me.
Awesome.
Okay, so we'll go for break now, everyone, and we'll be back in the number of minutes which will be shown on the break screen. So we'll see you all soon. We will be right back. And we are back. So, not sure, what was happening in the comment section during the break, but I think there's probably more stuff that Anthony is going to have to address now that people have been writing. We'll take a look shortly and see, what there is to address and what questions can be answered. And those questions, if there are any, will be answered at the end. So, I see that you're also back with us as well, Anthony. Anthony, and we'll see where we go. So, the next question I had for you, after that one, the next question I had was Saudi Arabia. So, Saudi Arabia is continuing to pursue a 2030 vision for reform in a state that is seeking to transform infrastructure, culture, and bring more business to the kingdom. Do you believe that this vision is practical and that it can be achieved? And what are some of the potential issues to such a vision that are not being addressed? In other words, what are the potential issues that they may run into that people are just not talking about yet? And also, is the vision even real?
Okay. Now, when it comes to the 2030 vision, we're talking about the 2030 vision brought forth by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia in 2011. His 2030 vision was to bring and rebuild up the infrastructure of the Saudi state, open it up to tourism, and bring it more towards business-orientated tourism coming into the kingdom. Now, that vision has since been taken up by King Salman and his son King bin Salman, or MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, as he's known. Now, when it comes to the 2030 vision, there has been a lot of cultural reforms that have been done within the kingdom. For example, women have been allowed to drive. Women have been also allowed to travel in certain circumstances. There's also been increased security development in regards to security intelligence sharing between Israel and the Saudi Arabia, which only shows really a normalization of bilateral relations between the two states in regards to security matters. There has been a opening up of a new tourism visa or new e-visa to the kingdom. So you can actually, for the first time, really in a long time, visit the kingdom. Now, these changes come in light of the past kingdom's really more Wahhabist, very conservative outlook since King Khalid. Now, for just people who don't know, basically in the 1970s, there was King Faisal, who was modernizing the state of Saudi Arabia. He allowed, for the first time, women to get educated and so on. However, he was assassinated in 1975 by his nephew, who was an Islamic extremist. And part of the reason for why he was assassinated was because he was perceived, you could say his reforms were perceived as westernizing the country and leading away from Islam. Because back then, the security of the Saudi state depended upon improving bilateral relations with states such as the United Kingdom and the United States. Since then, there was a significant event that happened in 1979 called the Grand Mosque Seizure, where Ortabi, and he's around about, I think, 27 followers, was it the last time I checked, tried to tried to capture the Grand Mosque in Mecca and declared that the king at the time, King Fahd, I believe, would have to abdicate from the throne. However, what happened instead, in order to try get those people, by the way, if you don't know what how the sort of the structure of Saudi Arabia works, you have ulama, which is sort of this Islamic, you could say, body in government. Then you have the government, who is, of course, under the submission of this absolute monarchy, which, of course, is the monarch of King Saud, coming from King Saud initially, and sort of we call it the Saudi monarch, or the Kingdom of Saud, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
And every single king that has since been has always been a son of King Saud, essentially. But anyway, to cut a long story short, in order for French special forces to get into the Grand Mosque, they had to actually get a fatwa from the ulama, and in order for the fatwa to be given, there had to be concessions made by the Saudi government to the ulama. So one of these concessions made was to impose something called male guardianship, which essentially renders women as essentially the property of men, where they have to have a male guardian for most areas of life. This banned, of course, women driving, and it sort of opened up the next era, you could say, of Wahhabist support and conservative support for, you could say, Wahhabist movements globally, as sort of almost like a reaction to the threat that potentially there could be an uprising within the kingdom. And that has been the attitude right up until the early 2000s, where King Abdullah comes into power. He starts to make slow reforms. However, it's only really with with this individual known as Mohammed bin Salman, or what is known as the Sun King, where we see this transformation come into reality. Now, I think that the vision has been done purely, I would say, for his sort of consolidation of power, because he has removed essentially the previous heir to the throne, which was going to be coming after King Salman. Because as I said before, each of the kings have been always sons directly of King Saud. Yes. However, it's now bin Salman will be actually the first, not only the youngest king, but the first king that's not really just the son of King Saud. So he got rid of his political opponents, and he's been consolidating power, really. And this 2030 vision is trying to also build bilateral relations with the West, which the West has been viewed as being a bit distant to Saudi Arabia ever since the JCPOA, which you can talk about a bit later as well, because the JCPOA really sort of threatened Saudi Arabia's vision of 2030, because they thought that, okay, the United States is going to slowly abandon them. They need to do something. They need to change course. And part of the reason why this growing of relations between these states and this modernizing, you could say, is happening, is because purely bin Salman, as well as the Kingdom of Saud, wants to survive this growing change that is going on throughout the world, especially with the advent
of how the United States and the population of the United States, and particularly in other Western countries, views them now. And because of this rivalry that they have with Iran, they want to present Saudi Arabia as being a place that is improving and moving toward values which are understood in the West. Is that that's basically what it is? So it's a cynical play in your explanation of this, right?
Yeah, it's a cynical play to try maintain the control of the Saudi monarch, as well as to make sure bin Salman is viewed as this new reformer king. He wants to be in the same light as King Faisal was, while trying at the same time to make sure that he doesn't steer too far radical, so he doesn't get that, as I said before, this more radical push from the Islamist bodies.
Do you think it's been successful so far? Or To what extent do you think it's been successful so far? Because so far, what we've seen, or at least obviously I'm viewing it from a perhaps biased point of view, but the only things that I've seen coming from them so far have been them talking about allowing women to drive and then immediately turning around and arresting the very same women's rights activists who had campaigned for that in the first place. Then we also saw them talking about security in the Middle East, but then flooding the internet with a bunch of like pro-Saudi bots that go around insulting people whenever anyone advocates anything that clashes with what Saudi's traditional social mores have been. And then also on top of that, they've had the war in Yemen, which has been going on for quite some time now, and people's concerns about civil rights violations that are going on and violations of the rules of war and the misuse of weapons on civilians, etc., etc. So like in terms of the public relations that they've been attempting to do you think that they've even been close to successful?
Now, in terms of PR, we can also acknowledge the deaths of journalists like Jamal Khashoggi, basically, who was, of course, killed by bin Salman. If you want to add onto that list of all the potential PR flops that the Saudi Arabia regime has had to deal with. Now, when it comes to let's sort of take one matter at a time. Now, when it comes to the Saudi women's activists, the rationale given by the kingdom for the arrest of activists like, I would say, I think her name for the life of me is Lujain El Hathor. I think she's one of those women's rights activists who have been arrested by the kingdom. The justification for these arrests that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia gives is the fact that they work for Qatari agencies. That's their justification that they're given. Whether they do or not is, of course, subject to scrutiny, which I honestly believe. I think it's just an excuse to get rid of the more vocal proponents for more radical changes. Now, the kingdom's trying to, as I mentioned before,
if I can just get in there as well, just before, I don't want to distract you from the thought you were about to explain, but I'm wondering if their excuse on the basis of blaming this on Qatar somehow is going to be that they were interviewed by a particular news station from Qatar once, and then this resulted in them claiming that this connection exists. Is that the kind of thing that Saudi Arabia is probably going to say?
It's more, well, it's actually kind of complicated. I don't want to go too much into detail, but to cut a long story short, yes and no, because the Saudi regime also points towards family ties to the Qatari government, basically, which some of these activists do have, although I don't want to give into the narrative that the Saudi regime is pumping basically on this matter. Now, when in regards to the war against the Houthis in Yemen, that, by the way, comes also from bin Salman, who used to be the foreign minister. He was the one who actually started the war in 2015. And that war was done, at least from Saudi Arabia's perspective, to protect its interest against encroaching IRGC influence by backing of the Houthis. Now, as we know that the Houthis were trying to do a revolution within Yemen at the time, and that, of course, led to the death of the dictator over there. And this now, of course, ongoing civil war, which the Saudis have participated in greatly. I mean, along with the UAE, they've bombed civilian centers along with US intelligence, really, to bomb these areas. It's mainly done for its national security, as it claims to be. It's done for its national security because the threat, it is very threatened, by the way. And this is the other element, I guess, of this whole 2030 vision as well, and this whole growing US bilateral relations, is that it fears IRGC influence. And as I mentioned before, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps is one of the largest, you could say, military bodies of the Ayatollah regime in Iran for its expansion. And the IRGC has been shown to be funding the Houthis in Yemen as well as elsewhere. So for Saudi Arabia, as sort of perceived GCC and GCC members or GCC leaders in this quote-unquote Muslim coalition that the United States keeps quoting about Saudi Arabia, for the United States and Saudi Arabia, making sure that the Houthis do not gain control in the south and threatening, I guess, the southern flank for Saudi Arabia is important. So that's the one matter. As for the Jamal thing, it's quite interesting that the Saudi regime now treats the opportunity to kill Jamal Khashoggi, because Jamal Khashoggi used to be actually an ardent supporter of the Saudi kingdom right in through the 90s. He used to write for things like Arab News and Al Arab, which are sort of state media run Saudi papers, essentially. He used to be a good friend of the kingdom. However, in 2017, 2018, he became a bit more vocal in his criticisms. And after the Saudi regime tried to tell him to stop, or essentially they hired their own hitman, essentially, to kill him in Istanbul, Turkey. And that obviously has been a very bad PR move, and not only just a big kind of humanitarian, I mean, I guess human rights violations, just basic things that have been bad for it. So I think to kind of summarize your question, I think that it's working slowly, but there needs to be more to be done. In other words, actually needs to be a bigger push for reform in the kingdom. However, it's on that balancing knife edge, because I do understand from bin Salman's perspective that if he pushes too hard, you could get a reaction from the Islamist bloc within the kingdom, and that could actually throw the whole process into disarray.
Yeah, so they're having quite a balancing act going on there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a knife edge that is going on at the moment. It's a real knife edge that the Saudi king at the moment is dealing with, because King Salman, the current king right now, he's sort of stepped away from the limelight, and he's allowed his son, or the Sun King as they call it now, bin Salman, or Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, to actually take up the reins and act as almost like a de facto king, essentially, when it comes to Saudi's relations. The king at the moment now is only serving really a symbolic role. It's almost like a kind of a constitutional monarch going on at the moment. However, of course, we know it's an absolute monarch. So these are all the kind of things that are going through the Saudi regime's mind. Do I think that the 20 vision will be successful? Yes, but I only think it will push it in the direction of potentially Kuwait or even the UAE to some extent, because it'll push it in that direction where you'll have still an absolute monarch in control, with maybe a little bit more rights for women, but it won't be this huge democratic project that a lot of progressives want it to be, and it won't ever be that for a long time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you on that as well. I mean, that's a really succinct and comprehensive explanation of what's going on there. So, yeah, I mean, how do you perceive Iran responding to the way that they're seeing things developing in the Saudi kingdom as well? Do you think that it's going to result in kind of like a strange race toward trying to appear to be more progressive than they actually are? Or do you think Iran's just going to hold its ground and not even bother to engage in this?
Well, the thing about when it comes to Iran, women are actually allowed to drive in Iran. Iran doesn't really have the same kind of restrictions as Saudi Arabia. However, saying that, we have to remember that the whole foreign policy of the Iranian state at the moment is very ideological, has been since 1979, since Khomeini took power with the Ayatollah regime and the Mullah regime in general, is that we have this quasi-fusion between quote-unquote theocracy and quote-unquote this quasi-version of democracy, where it's not really democracy, it's more democracy in more form of the government itself, but not, and the people electing their kind of like pre-existing government officials, you could say, and these government officials essentially are then selected from the Ayatollah and all that kind of stuff. It's a very complicated system, but it's still, when it comes to the Ayatollah regime in general, they still, of course, have problems when it comes to dissenters. They have this whole security apparatus. Now, when there's always this comparison between, okay, which is worse, Saudi Arabia or Iran? When it comes to being a foreign policy threat, Iran takes the cake on that. Saudi Arabia, despite everything, despite it still being a totalitarian state internally, it's not a problem in terms of foreign policy for the United States and for the wider coalition, because it's actually been one of the tightest partners that the Americans have had when it comes to engaging in such like the war on terror and larger security matters in the Middle East. Whereas Iran's viewed as this pariah state where it has this ideological vision of Shia expansionism that it uses through its IRGC proxies in places like Iraq, Yemen, and Syria. So when it comes, they view, for example, the Saudi state as being almost a puppet of the United States, because for Iran, actually, they view more Israel as a greater threat than Saudi Arabia, believe it or not. Even though there has been analysts who have said that there's this Cold War going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that's kind of true, but it's more like a Cold War going on between Israel and Iran, because Israel is viewed as a Zionist state, and the IRGC views Zionism as a threat to the Middle East, and they view it as their obligation to try to contain Israel's quote-unquote expansionism in other countries such as Syria and all that kind of stuff.
Do they perceive Mohammed bin Salman's association with Jared Kushner and the so-called plan for peace in Palestine as being, sort of part and parcel of that kind of dynamic? In other words, is the Trump administration's behavior in fact leaning into Iranian propaganda?
Again, when it comes to propaganda in general, propaganda is not designed to make you believe one side. It's made it's designed to make you confused, to believe no sides. That's sort of the purpose of propaganda in essence. But to answer your question, yes, Jared Kushner has been a big friend to bin Salman, and part of the peace plan, I suspect, comes out of agreement between Saudi Arabia and, to a lesser extent, Israel as well. Because people actually forget that for a long time, Saudi Arabia supported the PLO and supported openly this whole notion of the PLO existing and Israel not existing, because a lot of these Arab states don't acknowledge the existence of the Israeli state.
Exactly. So how do they explain their current position? That's the thing.
Yeah. So now this is when it comes to these kind of positions. The Saudi state has a public position, like Jordan has a public position, and Egypt has a public position. Also, although Egypt's position is a bit different, but to get back to Saudi Arabia, they have public positions, but in private, for example, they support, like as I said before, Saudi Arabia has been building relations with Israel, and they actually support Israel's, you could say, annexation of the West Bank. So the only reason why they're opposed politically to this in terms of the public sphere is so that they don't get their internal
politics don't fully align with their external behavior, and so they need to manage these two spheres and not let the two stances cross paths publicly, because otherwise then that becomes a problem for them to explain and justify. So internally they have to maintain the position of essentially running lots and lots of pieces about how they don't like the state of Israel, and then when they're actually dealing with Israel in the real world outside of that sphere of domestic politics, they then need to find ways to get along with them, along with many of the other countries in the Middle East, to form what were they calling this thing again? They were calling it the moderate crescent or something like this. Which is quite an interesting way of
for Israel, for Iran, Iran's trying to form a Shia crescent. So that's basically the land route that can expand its influence all the way to Lebanon against Israel.
But I mean, Saudi Arabia's alliance of people that they were trying to create, they simply just named it the opposite of that. So they named it the moderate crescent, which was quite funny.
I guess it's moderate crescent. The one thing I also want to mention is that a lot of the West Bank, a lot of the Palestinian territories has been a massive headache for a lot of Middle Eastern countries, including, admittedly, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia especially. Now, Saudi Arabia, for example, has tried to push the PLO to try and agree to the most basic of terms for the Israelis. And they've constantly refused, because they constantly refuse to acknowledge Israel as a state that exists. That's the problem with the PLO and Hamas in general, and a lot of these Arab states, that they refuse to acknowledge the most basic principle of acknowledging that Israel has a right to exist. Because that's what Egypt did. Egypt acknowledged that Israel, under Anwar Sadat, Egypt acknowledged that Israel has a right to exist, and acknowledged its position, and even had an agreement with them with the Camp David Accords, which allowed them to have the Sinai Peninsula back. But when it comes to Israel annexing these territories, Saudi Arabia, I suspect, secretly wants Israel to just annex all the territories so they can get that headache out their hands, basically. Jordan, of course, with King Abdullah, he's been an advocate against this, of course, but he himself has the East Bank population and a large Palestinian population within his state. A lot of people forget that in the Middle East, these states, as I said before, they have public and private positions. And in private, you'll see that they work more together. As I said before, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are all working in terms of security and like that. And they won't admit publicly that they're doing this, simply so they don't get their own internal populations rising against them. Yeah.
And this, of course, provides ample opportunities for the United States to actually raise this as an issue with them constantly, because I can imagine that in conversations with the Jordanian government, with the government of Egypt, and with Saudi Arabia, the United States can always bring up that, well, we could just expose the situation as it actually is, and then watch and see what happens to your rulership.
But here's the problem with that, is when they do that, they could just say, deny this position. Because who's going to believe the American great Satan, basically? Who's going to believe the American
Zion? They would threaten to do it through second parties, obviously. If they were going to bring these countries into line on a particular policy issue, they could just hint that, okay, we will leak something through a second party.
Well, again, it's a much harder. It's much harder said than done, I guess, when it comes to those
easier said than done.
Easier. There we go. Easier said than done. See, I'm already mixing up my harder and easiest. But that's the main drive. If we take things like Gaza, for example, Egypt doesn't want Gaza, Israel doesn't want Gaza, so they allow, for example, Hamas to exist in Gaza, because they both don't want those areas of, they don't want that area, even though Israel claims under this right-wing government, under the Likud party of Benjamin
They would
Netanyahu.
like to absorb it. I have a strong feeling that they actually don't want to because of the demographic effects of doing so.
Yeah, they don't want you. At the end of the day, Benjamin Netanyahu is a brilliant career politician. He reminds me a bit of Erdogan when it comes to in Turkey, but Benjamin Netanyahu is a brilliant, I guess, career politician, and you can see that he's trying at the moment, trying to satisfy the more right-wing elements within the government, while at the same time not going too far. So it's a very complicated process, because you can see Benjamin Netanyahu who's taking advantage of the Trump administration when it comes to their incompetency, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you've answered these questions very well, and I think we've covered that comprehensively. We're already at an hour and 18 minutes. So with a view that we probably have roughly 15 to 20 minutes remaining before we hit the time that we had set for ourselves, what I'll try to do is I'll see if I can get in 2 more questions on here, and then what we'll do is if we think that we need to actually do more, then I can essentially just invite you back again, because now we've got a system where you just press the button and it works, right? So it's very easy to start up streams. So obviously I intend to invite you back many more future times, and of course you get to select the topics. So the question I have for you then, out of the last 2 that I have that I think we can fit in here, is you mentioned the Joint Comprehensive Partnership before, the JCPOA deal. Now, the question I have here is the tearing up of the JCPOA and the increased hostilities between the US and Iran, between the 2 states, has escalated since the death of Soleimani. With these rising tensions in places such as Iraq, where do you believe the directions of relations are going to go? And what are your thoughts on the notion of regime change in Iran? Is such a thing even viable?
Okay. Now, I should just establish my position on the JCPOA. I personally believe that it was not a good deal, because it essentially empowered the IRGC activity and the Ayatollah regime's clandestine activities in Syria and Iraq. It also the regime of the Ayatollahs used that money to to fund the IRGC activities, and it didn't really change the behavior of the state that it was intended to do so. So the deal, in my mind, yes, I understand that you could say that it pressured Saudi Arabia essentially to try and negotiate or talk with Iraq government, and did pressure a lot of governments to try engage with one another. However, there was much more ramifications on the domestic level for not only Iranian society, but also neighboring countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, to name a few, as well as Lebanon, because they expanded the clandestine activity. Now, as for your other matter, the other part of the question, I guess, is that when it comes to the Ayatollah regime, I think that a conventional war against them will not work, given the whole landmass of the country, and given the fact that there's a huge radical population that has within the country. Now, the problem with it as well, and I just wanted to, I guess maybe let me rewind again. The reason why the Trump administration tore up the JCPOA is actually much more petty than many people believe it to be. The reason why the Trump administration tore up the JCPOA is because the Trump administration fundamentally did not like the fact that the Obama administration put its signature on the JCPOA. So what it wants to do instead is to force, through sanctions, the Ayatollah regime back to the negotiating table, so the Trump administration can itself create
another JCPOA, just not as good as the previous one, thus making it somehow even worse. And I mean, let me just go over what I think the JCPOA was originally about, because I think a lot of people never understood this one. But basically, the purpose of the JCPOA, as it was originally signed, and although it didn't work out this way, I'm just describing what the intentionality behind it was, which is obviously different from the results and the outcome. So, of course, my argument will be that the Trump administration did not learn from the events which came after that. So the JCPOA was supposed to obviously place a control on the enrichment of nuclear materials that was going on in Iran. It was to provide the IAEA access to sites in which this was occurring, so that people wouldn't have to keep using stuff like Stuxnet to shut everything down. So there is that. Also, at the same time, the JCPOA had built into it something that was extremely intelligent, at least on the surface level, because this is how we all viewed it at the time. It actually understood the structure of class society in Iran at the time and attempted to manipulate it in such a way that it would serve the cause of liberal internationalism. And this is how it was supposed to have played out. the JCPOA would be politically convenient for those members of the Iranian government that were actually closest to the sort of the bourgeois business interests that want to trade with the outside world in Europe and the United States and so on. So the signing of the JCPOA and its success would therefore empower these particular individuals in the industries that they oversaw in the government of Rouhani, and it would disempower, relatively speaking, those members who are sort of more fundamentalistic, more religiously inclined, and so on, who would be seen to have actually not produced good results prior to that moment. And additionally, there was a catch event after it as well, that even if it didn't play out that way, the narrative could then be twisted the other way to say that, okay, you signed the deal, you entered into the JCPOA, trade has resumed, and yet the people on the ground are not experiencing the wealth that should actually ordinarily be accumulated from trade. So where has it gone? And then, of course, the answer to that question would be, let's blame the mullahs. Maybe they've taken all the money that would have accumulated from trade that hasn't actually gone through. So it's kind of like, if it goes the correct way, the way that you're anticipating, then it works. And if it doesn't work, then you get to blame the mullahs for it. That's how the JCPOA, I think, was supposed to have worked out. Instead of that, what happened was what you predicted would happen, which is that they simply took the money and used it in clandestine operations abroad.
Okay, so just to address a couple things, I think the JCPOA draft is kind of well, actually, I don't know whether you would say miscalculated, because
I'd say it's a miscalculation, because we didn't anticipate they'd actually just spend the money on fighting.
Yeah, and I also kind of suspect that Kerry has his own business interests in Iran to begin with, so I don't actually believe that he had the people's interests in heart to begin with. But that's another matter for another day. But basically, what I say that it didn't actually do the thing that it was meant to do in that respect, because the reformers weren't actually empowered. Yes, some reformers got through the mechanical process, I guess, for the theocracy. However, people thought that Rouhani, for example, would be a reformer, but the problem is that they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the Ayatollah regime. They think it's a rational state actor that just with a few tweaks we can change, and therefore we'll have this rise of liberalism within the country. This is almost like this neoliberal notion, basically, that economic liberalization will lead to political liberalization or something like that. I think that that's a fundamentally flawed miscalculation, as I mentioned to you, because one, it sort of misunderstands that the foreign policy of the state for the last 40 years has been purely ideologically zealous in its interpretation of the world. It does not believe that it can let me repeat that. It does not believe that it can have peace, for example, with Israel. It does not believe that it should allow Sunni states such as Saudi Arabia to exist. It believes in this Shia extremist revolution and the expansion of this revolution. That's why I can call it, you could say, revolutionary expansionism. It's an expansionist state at the end of the day. It's expanding is expanding its tentacles really into places like Iraq by turning the Iraqi state into almost like a Shia vassal state. It's doing that in Syria by turning the Syrian state into a Shia vassal state. It's doing that in Lebanon to try to turn it into a Shia vassal state with Hezbollah. So you can see immediately what it's trying to do. It's trying to make these states align with this Shia extremist ideology so it can contain what it perceives as the great Satan, or the little Satan, the great Satan of Zionism. That's what it means. It's perceived. That's how it perceives the world. So fundamentally, the people who were like the liberal elites, basically, and the liberal people who were like Obama, Kerry, Biden, like that, who were trying to negotiate this deal. Yes, I'm sure that some of them had the best interests in heart. Some of them had more business interests in mind, I would assume. But at the end of the day, they miscalculated the nature of the regime. And because they miscalculated it, they've actually failed to understand that the RGC activity still continued. It actually increased in places like Syria and Iraq. Now, when you mentioned the death of Qasem Soleimani, a lot of people thought that, for example, that would bring a huge world war, basically. I heard online, there's going to be a big war like that. But people forget that when it comes to the death of Qasem Soleimani, that man had been empowering RGC elements in Syria and Iraq and had been responsible for the deaths of not only Americans in the Iraq war, by the way, of about 600 Americans in the Iraq war not during the insurgency, but also during the surge period as well. But he was also responsible for thousands of deaths within Syria itself. Now, this man was a dangerous target. He was with another man called Mohandas. Mohandas founders, for those who don't know, he was the leader of Kataib Hezbollah. Kataib Hezbollah is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States and is responsible for many different activities against U.S. personnel during the Iraq War, as well as during the war against ISIS. And this Kataib Hezbollah is a part of something called the Hashd al-Shabi, which is this coalition of Shiite paramilitaries that is backed by not only previously by Maliki's government, but also by the IRGC, and has now become, I guess, a legal part of the government. It has a sort of, you could say, a political party called the Fatah Alliance, and it's using that alliance to try steer Iraq, for example, the Iraqi parliament, as well as with all these other IRGC-backed and pro-Iran political parties, try to steer the state towards this Shia extremist vassal state for Iran. Now, Qasem Soleimani was spotted on the way to Baghdad International Airport, so U.S. CENTCOM intelligence forces, gave you could say, a memo to Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper, and they sort of gave the go-ahead after Trump gave the go-ahead to kill Qasem Soleimani. Now, people must realize that Kataib Hezbollah was actually planning attacks and was doing attacks against the U.S. embassy. So against U.S. in terms of U.S. national security, they wanted to eliminate Qasem Soleimani before he could actually do more activities against the United States. Since then, there was these strikes that were launched by the Ayatollah regime into Iraq. However, what happened with that is that all the strikes meant to, quote unquote, hit targets didn't do as much damage as they wanted to. And instead, they ended up, of course, they ended up shooting down a civilian airliner as well on the process. Because at the end of the day, when you actually confront this beast, this ideological beast, you see how weak it can be and how much of a paper tiger sometimes it can come off to be.
Yes.
So,
because, I mean, that was unprecedented in just in terms of the level of an absolute debacle that entire sequence of events was. First, they lost Soleimani. Then they failed to sufficiently explain how that could have been possible. And then they had a massive air accident in which they shot down a commercial airliner.
Can I just interject one moment here? Because there's this stupid comment that I've just read now where this individual by the name of John DeWitt says Iraqi MPs voted to kick out all U.S. forces in Iraq after the Soleimani assassination. Does Anthony think their democratic will should be respected? May I just say, it was mainly the Iranian Shia-backed bloc of the Iraqi parliament that voted. Guess who voted against it? The Sunnis and the Kurds. They vetoed it. That's why it never became part of legislation. And it was mainly done by Sadr and his group, who have been always fanatically against the US president. So this notion...
Al-Sadr.
Yeah, the notion that, the Iraqi people were the ones doing this, it's bullshit. It was the Iranian-backed, the Shiite bloc of the parliament that was doing
I find that people often say these things as well without actually taking into account what the outcome of the vote was. So when Jan says that the Iraqi MPs voted... Yeah, but I mean, he doesn't point out that they actually lost that vote.
Yeah,
they were outnumbered by the other people who actually voted against that position.
Yeah, then that's also the one thing as well. Now, may I just say, of course, you could say, oh yes, they are Iraqi citizens and like that, but you must realize that a lot of Iraqis who protested, may I just say, against the corruption of the parliament and against the corruption, so you could say the Iranian influence of the government, a lot of them, for example, are also Iraqi citizens. Then they view these people, these parliamentarians, quote unquote, like Sadr, as essentially Iranian agents. Some of them, you would say, oh, what about Sadr's men? And what about Sistani's men, for example, who support this notion? Yes, but there's different blocks of Iraqi society. My point is that there were huge Iraqi protests basically against corruption and against IRGC influence within the state, as well as, may I just say, also against US influence in the state. It was not just against one thing, it was against both. And it was Iraqis basically saying that... Yeah, sorry, go.
Yeah, and there's been plenty of resistance against them on the social front as well, not just on the foreign policy front. Because now that you mention Al-Sadr and Sistani, for example, who I've always despised Ali al-Sistani, but more on that some other day. But basically, these people these fundamentalists have been pushing so many ridiculous laws in Iraq that have been opposed by the majority. Do you remember something called the Jafari Personal Law?
Yes, I remember that.
Oh, what a disaster that was. That was just the most. It was one of those things where when I read that piece of legislation, I thought to myself, what kind of like narcotics does a person have to be on to actually write that? I mean, these people, I'm not going to just describe it. I'm not going to describe in graphic detail as to what it was that law was about. So don't do that. But I'll just say that the law itself intended to legalize sexual violence.
Yeah, against, well, actually, we should say against what type of and what age, basically.
Indeed, but it was the worst possible piece of legislation that could have been imagined in terms of human rights.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
they actually bald-facedly attempted to pass that nonsense, and the majority of Iraqi people opposed it. Was that not the case?
Well, I would assume, yes, if I remember so, because you've got to remember that in the parliament, there's so much different factions, different blocks. As I said, you got the Iranian bloc, you got the Shiite bloc, then you got the Shiite Iranian bloc, then you got the Sunni bloc, you got the Kurdish bloc as well. And the Sunni and Kurds, for example, they may not like what the US is doing, but the US is the only thing, the only barrier, and the coalition generals, the only barrier between, from between the failure of the state of Iraq, basically. Yeah. If they completely withdraw, the state of Iraq is completely gone. It's just gone. And to be totally honest, I'm for the Biden proposal of actually dividing that state on a confessionalist kind of system. Confessionalist system, on like kind of like a system whereby you have the 3 federal regions. You have the Kurdish region of Iraq, you have the Sunni region of Iraq, and you have the Sunni region of Iraq. And you just divided that.
So that they all have their own civic space and are responsible for the activities that go on in that civic space. And then you have more accountability, and then you have, of course, people not necessarily feeling that their rights are being trampled on as it was previously. Exactly. Because there seems to be these wild swings where, on the one hand, you have a Sunni-dominated state, and people who are of the Shia faith believe that they are being unjustly discriminated against. And then you have the reverse of that, which is, the post-surge Iraq as it manifested, which ended up being a Shia-dominated structure, in which then Sunnis began to feel as though they were being discriminated against, which then sent them on the path of Sunni rejectionism, which led to, several worst-case scenarios, right? Yeah. So there's got to be a way to prevent that from playing out every single time, like some kind of like ridiculous extremist seesaw. And the only way seems to be a form of federalism.
Yeah, and I can actually say that we must see the most stable part of Iraq, and I don't like to say it's part of Iraq because I respect the Kurds who say it's not a part of Iraq. They consider themselves not a part of Iraq, but it's the Kurdish region that is the most stable part of Iraq. If you want to go to any stable part, you go to the Kurdish region. That's where actually all the US diplomats, when they go on holiday, and I'll be honest, I also went on holiday there as well, technically, and also I did other stuff as well, but they always go to the Kurdish region. They hate going to Baghdad. Guess why? Because they've got to pay for security detail. They've got to make sure that they have their security details so they don't get shot or blown up, basically, on the way there.
Exactly. Because how many times has that occurred now as well? I mean, it's like everything that I've heard from people who have been to Baghdad has been exactly what you just said as well, that you're on edge constantly. You're unable to ever relax for a single moment because of the fact that at any moment, even when you're in the green zone, at any moment, something ridiculous can begin to happen.
And of course, we have to acknowledge the complex history of Iraq, which we won't get into detail. But when people try to compare it, like, you get these white nationalists, basically, who masquerade, I guess, as alt-righters or whatever you want to call it. When they say, oh, look at, the multiculturalism of the Iraqi state, or it's another failed state like that, we should now apply some form of ethno-nationalism to our state to protect our white majority or whatever that may be. And may I just say that a lot of them don't even agree on who's fucking white to begin with. I'll just say, put it that way, like that, is that you have to forget that for Iraq, basically, it was created by the British mandate. It's never used to be like a state with its own longevity history. It's always been some form of an authoritarian state, whether it be under a king or whether it be under dictators. And this whole democracy is a new thing. And obviously, it's not going to like pan out as it's not going to automatically like become like Japan or something like that after World War II.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So okay.
Speaking of which, because I mean, we are coming down to the end. But all of these questions that people have put in the chat, we might have to actually cover those questions separately on a panel show.
Yeah, I think that would be actually fair. Like, I'm fair with that. Like, you write down some of the questions because I know despite my kind of like my antagonistic character that I'm putting on now, I guess, is that I am open to discussing these things.
Of course. But I mean, obviously, the reason I'm suggesting to do it that way is because otherwise we'd have to scroll all the way back up and then go through each of the questions. Unless, of course, you actually want to do that, in which case then I'd have no problem doing that. I'd have no problem doing that now. But I think it'd be better on a panel show where like even more people can essentially weigh in.
I think that would be, because that would be much more interesting. I think you had like one last question, I think.
Yeah. So it wasn't a question, but more an observation, because this is something we talked about before we went on the show, which was you mentioned the British mandate just now. Now, obviously, in the Middle East, in the context of the Middle East, there's the British mandate and there were the French mandates. And we had a conversation about how, both of these things have their downsides, because, of course, obviously, you don't want to have a mandate of someone else inside of your country, obviously. But in terms of survivability of states, or in terms of stability of society, we had arrived at a kind of an understanding that British mandates tended in the long run to be actually more stable than the French ones. Was this the conclusion we came to? And what was the reasoning we had for that, just for the benefit of the audience?
It's because the British would establish their own forms. They would allow, for example, local leaders to govern their own kind of provinces, if you will. And it would allow them, they gave a bit more empowerment, I guess, to the indigenous populations while still maintaining some of their offices, if you will. But I do admit, one of the comments also mentioned that, based off the Ottoman vilayet system, it was kind of based off of that, except a bit more like, it reminds me of like, it kind of is comparable to almost a little bit like India, where they allowed their own like little leaders to govern their own areas within India under the principalities. Yeah, it's akin to that, and I think it worked that way. The French were more direct control. The French, as I said before, we can look at their experiences in places like Syria. They first tried their own like little route with trying to allow a king to rule, and then they found out that there was uprisings, so they had to get the French army in, and this all led to, of course, the final uprisings in 1945, 1946, where the sort of Syrian nationals kicked out the French, out the government, basically. So we just have to remember that as well. So I think it's just because the British system was more calm, and I would say not calm, I say more calculating as to how to best try to expand influence when you have a limited amount of troop personnel that you can use.
Exactly. No, that's very right. And so would you compare the Biden plan to the extent that you described there as being a sort of a confederalist type plan for Iraq? Would you say that the Biden plan is closer to the spirit of how versus approach?
That's a good point. There's a treaty that the British and French, as well as the League of Nations, we're going to try implement. It's called the Treaty of Severus, which we're just going to try. This applies more to the Turkish context before, of course, the Turkish War of Independence. But for example, a place like Turkey, they wanted to create an independent Kurdish state. So that idea of like creating little states basically for their ethnicity. So they wanted to create like an Arab state, a Kurdish state, a Sunni state, and that was to try appease these different groups of people. May I just say this whole idea of even nationalism to begin with, it's more like a European imported concept, because a lot of the times we think that all these native groups basically have the sense of Arab nationalism or something like that. I mean, my Israeli friend I talked to as well, which he'll remain sort of nameless, but he, for example, looked at the Arab revolts, and there's a lot of the times when it comes to the Arab revolts, there was no sense of, like, we have this perception in the West that we read history, we have this romantic notion that there was this united Arab front against the Ottoman Empire. It was not really like that. It was more like disfranchised little groups, basically, who were trying to be opportunistic and try to fight for their own sort of like little fiefdoms, really.
Yeah, because their own particular kingdoms that they wanted to found.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the thing, is that this whole sense of nationalism is actually a very modern concept, especially in the Middle East. Like we see it when we see like nationalism, we see like things like Turkish nationalism or Pan-Arabism or something like that, or Baathism. These are forms of nationalisms that are reactionary, I guess, to the time of imperialism at that time, as well as to the sense of growing understanding for European ideas of nationhood. So do you know what's kind of ironic about the whole thing? Part of the reasons for why imperialism in general around the world failed was because the educated elite, indigenous elite, basically, of a lot of these states, whether it be in India or Syria or even Iraq were educated in European-style universities.
Ideals, which led them
Yeah.
to believe that they needed to prevent themselves from being conquered by Europeans.
Yeah, and believe in this whole notion of nationhood.
The notion of nationalism, which would necessarily exclude having random people who are not part of your nation being the actual administrators of the polity you live in.
Exactly. Can I just also say, when it comes to the whole, I just want to quickly address something because it's going to annoy me because I always get annoyed by this. A lot of people like to say that, thousands were killed in the Iraq war by the US coalition. That's actually not correct. Majority of them were killed actually by the Ayatollah-backed proxies within Iraq, as well as Al-Qaeda and other insurgent groups, basically. Just to put that to the side.
That thing about the kill counts to be quite misleading sometimes.
Yeah, it is misleading based on this.
You should just take the total number of deaths and then somehow attribute every single one of those persons to NATO occupation, as opposed to people who were behaving badly during that time period.
It's a simplification. It ignores the history, and often the statistics are wrong, and people like to buy into that misinformation. They buy it wholesale because they've got this whole perception of the United States, which is more like, I'm not saying that it's wrong necessarily, but it just lacks the nuance like that. So I won't actually get into that matter. But I also want to just touch on a matter because I think there was a question that you wanted to ask me on the Syrian, like a resolution for the Syrian conflict potentially.
Yes, that is the final question I didn't think we'd have time for, but I mean, we might as well just do it.
Actually, just get it out of the way.
And there are still two more. There are actually still two more if you count that one. But yes, so the second last question was going to be: you support a number of different minority struggles in the Middle East, which you've talked about here today, notably the Kurdish struggle for statehood. Why do you support this struggle, and what is your assessment of the struggle in relations to a reduction of U.S. troop presence in the northeast of Syria and the growing tensions between U.S., Turkey, and Iran?
I think I'll also build it into another question, of course, to do with what's the potential solutions for Syria as well. I guess I'll also like to lead it into that as well.
It's possible I actually read the wrong question.
Oh, okay.
It is. I've actually read the wrong question. I asked you this question earlier. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, I asked you that question probably like 45 minutes ago. This is the Syria question I meant to read to you just now. Syria remains embroiled in a decade-long conflict with no particular end in sight. With the perceived victory of an Assad regime in the conflict, how do you believe the conflict will end, and what do you believe the ideal situation should be in that state? That's the question.
Okay. Now, when it comes to Syria in general, the conflict is obviously being won at the moment by the Assad regime and its backers of Iran and Russia. Now, they are at the moment going to launch the campaign in Idlib, which is the northwest of Syria. But to cut a sort of a long story short, the Assad regime wants to retain control over the whole of the country. That includes Idlib as well as the northeast. And as I mentioned before, the Northeast is governed de facto by the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Self-Administration of North and East Syria, or AANES, with their own political system at the moment of democratic confederalism, or this decentralized council-based system where there's also civil militias as well as local councils that are representative of the local population. It's a complicated system. I'll go into another time. But I think the ideal situation for Syria, for example, if this was allowed, if the Assad regime somehow allowed for political settlement and somehow in this idealized reality this could occur, I would be for a federalism system being adopted within the whole of Syria. That's to say that having federal regions, whether it be in Idlib or in the Dara area or even in the northeast, where you have essentially provisional governments with their own form of autonomy and their own form of self-defense forces governing those areas, with the central government having not as much control as this unitary state has currently in Syria at the moment. That would be my first suggestion. My second suggestion, if that can't work, then I would like to see a confessionalist type system in accordance to places like Lebanon or Iraq, where you have essentially you have what is it? We could say an Alawite president, a Sunni prime minister, and maybe a head of parliament that is Kurdish or something like that.
Because this was the follow-up I was going to ask you in that as well, which is that people often discuss the Syrian conflict as though the Alawites are a majority, but they are not. They're actually a majority who was able to take power in the aftermath of the Second World War. And part of this was that the Alawites were extremely persecuted people during that time period. I mean, if you look at the history of them, you will, your heart will really actually, be breaking for the kind of things that they were subjected to. So how do you make sure that in a post-conflict Syria, you don't end up with people tolerating further persecution of Alawites because of what happened with the Assad family?
And that's what's going to be the case with trying to adopt something like I know that with the UN process at the moment, which is UN Resolution 2254, they're trying to bring some form of transitionary government where they're using the Syrian Constitutional Committee to try to build an idea of what parliament will look like. So there'll be opposition candidates, there'll be government candidates, and then there'll be UN chosen candidates that represent minorities like that. They're almost like designing it kind of like the post-status Iraq, basically. And unfortunately, as we know, the Assad regime has not really accepted that yet. But however, if they had to accept it, that would be more like a confessionalist style system where you have this kind of recognized minorities with protections, essentially, inside the constitution, and the government being essentially ruled in a state in which there will not be sort of a dominance of any one minority, but there will be protections for minorities in different religions. It's the kind of state where it's almost transitionary at the moment, could work as a transitionary system. However, people fear that could be broken up easily by the kind of internal dynamics that we saw in places like Lebanon with their fights against Christian populations versus the Muslim population.
It's a matter of how do you prevent it from actually becoming Lebanon?
That is actually. I think there's also you could also do the Israeli plan where you have like one recognized. You could have a recognized people basically as well, except there's much more rigorous constitutional protections for such as the Arabs as there are in of course Israel. So again, it really depends, because we have to realize that there are a lot of circumstances that are preventing this. We could of course acknowledge the fact that the Assad regime is a fanatical regime, that even with these sanctions, it's still going to hold on to power until its last battered breath, essentially.
And that's also because from their perspective, they may perceive it as them having no other choice. Because I mean, if they're looking out onto the Sunni majority now, I mean, especially now, not even just before, but now, they would definitely be fearing for their lives. And the thing about this conflict that I've always found extremely interesting is the way in which it's almost comparable to the Saudi story, but not in a way that anyone actually would ordinarily think of it. In the conversation we talked about before this stream, we talked about how Saudi Arabia ended up having to enter into that compromise situation of imposing more fundamentalist social norms in order to compensate for the uprising that happened in Mecca at that time that you talked about. Yes. Now, if we go back to the 1970s in Syria, we can actually see the genesis of this problem when conservatives in the countryside of Syria basically, had certain demands. The Sunnis had certain demands, and the Syrian government responded by actually editing the Syrian constitution in 1975 to include language that was socially conservative and which placed the Quran and the Sunnah as having constitutional relevance. Right? Because this didn't actually happen before. And that appeasement that was engaged in 1975 in Syria didn't seem to actually abate the conflict that was going to arrive in 1982 and that was going to arrive again in 2011 and so on.
I think that's a bit of a misreading, because even with Baathism, in terms of Assadism, there has been always this entity that to be Arab is to be Muslim. There's always been that connection. Even the 1970 constitution says to be Arab is to be Muslim. This whole notion of this pan-Arab identity as well as intertwined with the Islamic identity. So that's always been the case, actually, because you must remember that we perceive in the West, we can at least say that Christianity can be separated, because we have the whole notion of secularism. In those kind of states, they don't have it, because Islam is a part of the identity. It's a part of this. It's actually ingrained in the state structure, basically. So technically, every single Middle Eastern state, except for the exception, of course, Israel and a couple.
They inevitably do this. Do you think the long-term outcome would have been different if Syria had chosen not to take that action in 1975? Because keep in mind, 1975 would have been just after the point at which they had that large internal argument over like how to understand the word socialism in the context of
I
Arab
see what you mean.
socialism, right? So
Yeah.
if they had chosen to understand it in a slightly different way and had not inserted those clauses into the constitution, do you think that the long-term trajectory would have played out completely differently?
I think not, because at the end of the day, the ideology, irrespective of those internal disagreements, was still fanatical and still had this whole Arab, as I said, Arab Islamic identity being above all other identities. To be Syrian is to be Arab, as I mentioned before. I don't think there would actually have been much of a change. Now, you may have said that maybe we would have seen maybe like it become like more of like a Saddam state, because we have to remember that Saddam hated the Assads, like Iraq and
Yeah,
Syria
they
hated
didn't
one
agree
another.
with each other on very much.
Them being both Ba'athists, essentially. They
Exactly.
hated one
Syrian
another.
Baathism and Iraqi Baathism had like a split within them that went on. Well, we can't get into that. We'd be here all day. But yes,
Yeah.
go on.
No, to cut a long story short, I don't think it would have changed much of the circumstance. I think, if anything, it may have just meant that the uprisings may have come a bit sooner, I think, than
Okay.
they did happen. So
I'll also present to you now the China argument, and this is obviously sort of in light of the last question we're going to have. So I'm kind of like pivoting slowly in that direction.
okay, cool.
The China argument for 2011 in Syria would be, and I've seen this argument coming from many sources, including my own self, ironically, who argued that would it have been possible for Bashar al-Assad to have actually skipped the Arab Spring entirely if he had used geospatial intelligence linked with deep packet inspection when they decided to like open up the internet and allow Syrians to be on the internet, instead of opening up and letting everyone essentially go into WhatsApp and do whatever they wanted without any deep packet inspection and without any oversight as to what the citizens were doing, and also having geospatial intelligence so that if they were doing something or talking about things you didn't want to talk about, you could find out which region this was actually occurring in and how the organizing was going on. Do you think that because they didn't actually install the necessary equipment to do that, and they just threw the doors open instead of having their own sort of homegrown internet environment, kind of like how China has the firewall of China and WeChat instead of WhatsApp and their own customized apps? If Syria had had its own customized entry into the internet, do you think it would have been less probable that radicalization from the Arab Spring would have found people in their cell phones, which is the primary means in which the 2011 situation seems to have actually been generated, that everyone was on the internet on their phones and was able to easily communicate with each other and find out about what was happening?
I think you actually do have a point, because a lot of the reasons why, for example, those protests happened was because on the media, the abuse and death, brutalization of those children that wrote those slogans on the schools against Bashar al-Assad by this Muqarrabat was actually exposed online through Facebook and other such apps.
Indeed.
If that did not occur, I think the protests could have been squashed early on. So I do think that you have a point that if there had been some form of closed, so there's much more, I guess, a much robust security apparatus, I think then you could actually see at least the uprisings would have not happened, at least for the next couple of decades, if anything.
And this also feeds into a popular narration as well, which is that a state is at its most fragile just at the point at which a middle class starts to develop and the opening up begins. Because it seems to me, and I'm saying this with no moral judgment whatsoever, so I'm saying this with moral neutrality here, that whenever you begin to open up a state and you just let people go onto the internet, let's say you're a developing country, and you just let everyone go onto the internet and you have a middle class which is slowly rising, except your government is not reforming fast enough to keep up with what the people want. It's when you think you're doing a good job that things are actually at their most dangerous. And this is something you also see in field manuals published by the United States as well, but for a completely different context. But that tranquility that you think you're creating is actually the point at which you are most vulnerable to an uprising.
That's actually, that's very interesting, actually, you mentioned that, because it does make sense, because a lot of the Arab Spring, for example, came through social media. Had not social media been available for the masses, I don't think we would have the same uprisings as we saw with the Arab Spring. And it's partly because of these the social media apps that allowed for people to communicate with one another and to organize and to do so all those other things, because it was the opening up, as you mentioned. So you do have a point, and it would also be interesting then if, for example, if you mentioned China earlier, if China, for example, didn't have those security features in mind, what would be the potential.
Yeah, I wonder what would happen. And of course, my rhetorical wondering here, I mean, I would anticipate, based on what we've been saying so far, that you would see, if there was just like unfettered access and anyone could just do anything they wanted, you would see a scenario in which you would have an East-West division developing within China, because of the fact that you'd have people on the eastern side of China that's already developed, that have essentially seen the party with their own eyes doing certain things that they approve of. And then you'd have the people in the West who are only now discovering, because of the fact that obviously China is not universally developed, right? Much like how Syria was developed more in around the region of Latakia and around the coast. But on the inland part of the country, it was less developed. So it's obviously a two-track developmental process. China also is experiencing a two-track developmental process. And so inside the western part of China is probably where all of the trouble will actually occur, because these people would only now be getting onto the industrialization ladder, and they would immediately be exposed to every other country's narration about China on social media unfettered, which would then, of course, become a site of uprising. So I think a similar thing happened in the case of Syria, that those regions of Syria which had only just entered into an awareness of sort of grand politics beyond just the rudimentary understandings that you would expect someone on the ground to have, they were immediately overwhelmed by the amount of information available to them.
That's actually a good point, because the places where the revolution happened were in places like Dara, Hama, Idlib, and then less developed areas like Afrin, Kobani, and so on. And those places for a long time didn't have any access to internet and didn't have any access to social media. However, it seems that now with as you mentioned, the opening up, that could actually be, as I said before, that analysis I've not actually heard before, but it does make a lot of sense if you give it in the context of the state, although I would, of course, not make it a holistic kind of, reason as to why, that's why, for example.
Yeah, because of course it doesn't replace, obviously, the ground level reasons as to why someone will rise up. Because obviously there is the drought issue and the issue of being able to eat bread and so on. There are a lot of economic underpinnings, and of course there are the ideological religious underpinnings as well. It's just that the grafting of social media into that situation means that what previously would have been essentially slow transmission of ideas becomes extremely rapid and widespread transmission of ideas and thinking.
That's a good point. I didn't really consider that. So there's something actually I didn't really consider at all, and so something that I would have to actually more investigate now, because it's very interesting now to consider, because it just mentions a whole complete different dimension just from a national security perspective as well. Yes.
Because I mean, the phone is a powerful thing, very powerful thing. But I don't want to sound like Donald Trump saying that now. The phone is a powerful thing. You can tell that I've been up for too long. I've been awake too long.
Same.
I'm now starting to actually repeat myself. Okay. So the final topic that we have here now. North Korea has recently threatened to stop communication with South Korea after flyers were passed across the border. Now, obviously, there are people in the chat who are going to be laughing now, because this question which I am reading, the outcome of it has already actually happened yesterday morning, right? But I'll read the question anyway. But just know that this question was actually written 2 days ago, so that would explain why it no longer lines up with what actually happened. But reading on, North Korea has recently threatened to stop communication with South Korea after flyers were passed across the border from South Korea that had dissident slogans on them. Does this situation have the potential to escalate in the region? What are your thoughts?
So I'm just give me a little bit of breathing room. Yes.
Yes, I think we saw it escalate. They actually put bombs inside the Kaesong building and actually leveled the place. So it escalated. So after that escalation, do you see any further escalation beyond that escalation happening? I guess that's the new question.
Well, okay. I guess if we're going to go on what escalation, I think that when it comes to North Korea, I don't think that we're going to see despite all what's going on at the moment, despite these escalations, I don't think we're going to see a war break out anytime soon, actually. I think what's occurring now is that North Korea is becoming a bit more emboldened just by how, I guess, what it perceives as the West's encroachment, or as, I guess you could say, South Korea's violation of 2018, terms of agreements that are made in 2018 with South Korea.
Yeah.
I don't think
Although
now
this
when it
seems
comes
to be beyond South Korea's ability to regulate, though,
course.
because I mean, how do you
Of
sign an
course.
agreement saying we're not going to allow any citizens to attach notes to balloons? How do you
Of
even
course, you
police
can't do that. You can't do that. But I think when it comes to North Korea in general, people actually misunderstand the state because North Korea is, like many people know, it's a totalitarian state, but they don't actually know the extent to which it's a totalitarian state.
Uh-huh.
For example, it's military, like you have its air force, navy, and army all cut off from one another to prevent intelligence sharing. You have the fact that it jails up to 5 generations worth of dissenters, with one dissenter dissents against the government. You realize just how tightly knitted this totalitarian state is, because
Yeah.
there's no, and the reason why I call it tightly knitted, because there's actually no possibility for uprisings in the state. That's just how tightly knitted the society is around this, the
It
Kim
would have
dynasty.
to come from members of the government.
Yeah, other members of the government,
delivering the outcome, which is why the whole thing with Jang Song-taek was so incredibly important. When we found out, quote unquote, we found out that the people he was associated with were actually listed in the Panama Papers and were in China at the time. It seems to me that the possibility for change in North Korea comes from above and not from below. Basically,
I would say that not only that, but there's also potential that external influences will need to also pose for regime change. Because I connect the North Korean issue with the China issue, because China is the biggest enabler of North Korea. It's one of the biggest.
Although paradoxically, the least capable of actually restraining them as well. They're
Exactly,
in a
I
really
wanted to
strange
mention that as
relationship
well.
with them.
It's this weird relationship, because I think that even though China's, I guess, somewhat trying to regulate North Korea, they don't want North Korea to completely fall, because they view that if North Korea falls, South Korea will go up right to its border, and there will be a potential NATO.
This was something we saw. This was something we saw with the WikiLeaks leak on that precise question as well. That China's view of North Korea is basically a nuisance, and they would prefer to have a Korean peninsula governed by Seoul. However, the precondition, apparently, which they said in this WikiLeaks document, was from the cables that were leaked during that time period. But I mean, we could have inferred this without seeing the cable anyway. But China's preference, apparently, is that there should be a Korea run by Seoul. In other words, South Korea should be the actual government of the entire peninsula. But at the same time, they would like it so that the United States will not come all the way up to the border with China. That's the thing that they care about.
Now, you can actually view North Korea almost as a buffer state that China has. Like, North Korea is just a buffer state to the American influence.
I've described it as the landmines in the sea that doesn't actually exist. Like, if these countries could draw their ideal map of Asia, North Korea would actually just be ocean, and they would just have mines in that ocean, so you can drive a ship through it. And so the fact that it's a completely failed government and that no one can walk there becomes almost like, at least in the past, it was kind of like they probably viewed that as some kind of like positive attribute. And now it's become like, now they've realized exactly how bad that government is and how it doesn't actually do anything they tell it to, and that it's a constant danger to the world, and it's endangering, I should say, their trade partners. Now it's suddenly like, okay, how can we end this?
Yeah,
what sequence of activities need to happen for it to have ended? And this is why I was really really upset when Jang Song-taek was actually executed by Kim Jong-un, because it would have been a better North Korea if Jang had actually been able to get into power and enact Chinese-style reforms and then just end this ridiculous game.
Yeah, the thing is that whether or not we like to admit it or not, eventually there'll become a time when we'll no longer see the Kim dynasty as leaders of North Korea, hopefully in the next couple of decades, because that system is long. It's not long. It doesn't have any longevity, and China's getting, as you mentioned, quite sick of it. Actually, it doesn't want to totally secede it to South Korean influence by the Americans.
Not only that, but a large number of civilians on the ground as well are just are losing their ability to buy into the system as well. And how are they losing their ability to buy into the system? On the down low, obviously, because you can't really voice your dissent, otherwise you're a goner. But there are. I mean, we talked about this earlier on before the stream, that they have a sort of a black market in contraband USB drives now in North Korea, in which you can find like news reports from South Korea, news reports from China that describe situations that are ongoing, news reports from places in Western Europe with translations on them, K-pop videos, all kinds of stuff is coming in on these drives. And then there are also people who are sneaking into China across the northern border of North Korea. and they're going in there and they're actually finding like CD-ROMs and stuff that people have burned to sort of instruct them on how the rest of the world actually views activities that are going on in North Korea. And there have been like some interviews as well with some defectors who defected to South Korea who say that they actually were incentivized to defect by the information they learned while they were trading in black market USB drives, because they saw the information on the drives and were absolutely stunned that the world did not resemble the world which North Korea had told them existed.
And I think that's why I say that the solution to North Korea lies in China. I think that's my assessment. The solution to the North Korean issue lies in China. If you can get China basically on your side, or at least I know people like to go for the regime change option with the CCP falling up. That's not going to happen anytime likely. But if that can't happen, then the next option would be, of course, to work with China against North Korea.
Indeed, to produce optimal outcomes in that zone. So we've come up onto past 2 hours now. So I think we've actually covered all of the questions as well, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
So
cool.
I think you've been absolutely fantastic for coming on the show today. And you've been one of the best people I've interviewed so far. You're always welcome to come back anytime. So always feel free to just basically
come back.
Exactly. And we'll try to have you on panel shows as well. So this has been absolutely fantastic. For all of you who are listening for the first time, follow me on Twitter. You can also follow Anthony on Twitter as well. Like and subscribe to the channel. And I think we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.